APUSH people, it is day 2 of e-learning, and I just want to take a couple seconds to go over a few things. First, I just want to make sure you guys know we're just doing e-learning Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Those are the only days that I can give you new assignments. So I appreciate those of you that checked in today, like, what were we supposed to do? But nothing, because it's Thursday. So Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Again, second, if you're not seeing these videos, if they're not popping up for you, it's something on your end. And I have sent a gazillion emails showing you how and what steps to take to make sure that you are getting these emails, because it's something on your end that's happening. Probably the most important one to check is making sure that your YouTube settings are on your Gmail, especially if you've been watching other things on YouTube. So make sure you do that. Check those emails. And for those of you that are got it okay, and you're like, why is she sending these emails? Because lots of people can't look at them. So also attached to this lecture is an assignment that's not required, it's not mandatory, but I would really love to hear from you guys. So I have left an option for you to make a recording back to me. You don't have to do it. I would love for you to, so I can hear you and talk to you and see what you've been doing these 2 weeks. You can let me know anything you're thinking, AP test anxieties, just this is what I've been doing, and I'll leave the directions on how to do that at the end of this lecture. Also, last thing before we get into the lecture is Monday is a drop-off day. So if you've got paper that you want to drop off for me, and you need to do that from 11 to 1. Those are the times. You can't do it any earlier, any later. Also, for those of you that would like to pick up the paper copies of the lectures that will begin on Monday and the reading questions, you can pick that up on Monday as well, 11 to 1. There's packets there, copied, hole punched. I think I stapled all of them just in case. Those are there on Monday. You need to go in the back doors by the teacher lot, and Dr. Jenkins will be there to hand that out to you or to let you drop stuff off. So we're ready to get into our last part of World War I. We're going to finish that today, and then Monday we'll start on the 20s, and then we'll do Great Depression, and then we'll do isolation. We'll also start on Monday some different assignments other than the reading questions, and those assignments will be geared towards starting on getting prepared for the AP exam, the different AP exam. So I think we're on page 8, and again, sorry about me closing up and coming back. Trying to get used to this, and I'm not probably ever going to get used to it. So we're on page 8, mobilizing factories, and we ended our last lecture talking about how Wilson had a 2-prong approach to World War I. One, he had to get military ready, and 2, he had to create this home front united around a war that he spent 4 years saying, we don't need to be a part of it. We don't need to do this. So we need to do a couple of things in the private sector on the home front. And we call that the home front. One, the military and the army will need things. Everything from boots to blankets to canteens to helmets. And then also all of those military things like guns and ammunition and tanks and all of those things. World War I is also going to be a weird war because, again, it's the split in old warfare and this new industrial age warfare. So we'll have horses being used by both all parts of the military, and we'll also have cannon, and we'll kind of sort of have the beginnings of airplanes and blimps to monitor weather. We'll have poisonous gas, we'll have biological warfare, as well as hand-to-hand combat. So World War I is this different type of war, but one of the things that Wilson has to attack first is the home front. How am I going to gear up my country, my nation for war? And so a lot of it begins with things like a war industry board, which is on the bottom of page 8. So I'm just going to go through C, because we're not going to spend a lot of time looking at this mobilization in detail. You can read through those notes. But most importantly is C1, U.S. economy not initially geared for war. And shouldn't be a surprise. Very few nations are actually geared towards war. So we'll start building ships. We've only got an army of about 100,000 regulars, so we have to mobilize that. And please look, 15th in the world, which is really, really low, which also gives an indication of how the United States felt about having a standard army. We still are not at the point where we see the necessity of having a standard army. Our army is 15th in the world in 1917, which is a really, really low number. We have no idea how to do it. We haven't fought a war like this. The last war that we fought against someone across far away was the War of 1812. We have fought since then our own Civil War, the Spanish-American War, which kind of sort of was far away, but not really. Mexican-American War, and that's really kind of about it. So we are not really equipped, geared toward any kind of understanding of war. No one knew how much steel or explosives we even had, how much can we produce, and again, traditional fears of big government, that again will hold us back. You can look at that War Industry Board, this idea of centralizing all of that power. On page 9, the War Industry Board, really the most important one on this is that it sought to control raw materials, like how those raw materials are going to get placed to place. It never has a lot of power, and it's never able to maintain a lot of power as a result of that. Women encouraged to enter industry and agriculture. We still, as the beginning of World War I, women still do not have the right to vote yet. And when we get in our next chapter, the 1920s, we'll see where those suffragettes have an issue with the beginnings of World War I. 19th Amendment, obviously, we know is going to be passed in 1920. Big on page 9, big box or something around 3C. Thousands of African Americans in the South migrate north. This is called the Great Migration. It's going to happen really the whole time during World War I. It's going to happen as World War I begins and all those factories begin to gear up in the north. So this will be the real first migration after the Civil War into the North by Southern blacks. And a lot of things are going to happen. We'll get that in the 1920s. We're going to get a lot of racial tension as a result of that. But this is called the Great Migration. And so make sure you remember that, note it, and it is important in this time period in the 1920s. And the purpose of this first Great Migration is to participate in factories producing goods for war. It'll happen again after World War I when African American soldiers return home, and they again will migrate north as well. And if you look at C underneath that, race riots are going to occur in 26 cities, and these are very, very violent race riots that last an extended amount of time and will cause loss of life for both African Americans and white civilians as well. We'll really approach that in our next set of notes in the 1920s. We'll look at, flipping the page, the National Labor Board, and this again is about unions and striking, and we're not really going to touch too much on that either. We'll look more at that in the 1920s. What's really important is on page 10 is where we meet a future president, Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover is head of the Food Administration. And obviously, little side note here, because I still have to add my side notes, even though I'm at the comfort of my home. Herbert Hoover is a really important president that we'll look at again in the 1920s. He's going to be the president when we go into the Great Depression. But before that, this guy is a big deal. Such a big deal, like my granny has a brother named Herbert Hoover Hines. Right, because this guy, well, actually, he's not alive anymore, but yeah, his name was Herbert Hoover Hines, H-H-H. And my Uncle Herbert was a big part of my granny's family, but this is a really important guy, and he leaps out into the scene in World War I and with this food administration. He's a Quaker, very popular, and he will work towards making sure that food is distributed not only in the United States, but also to Europe. Also, one of the things that Herbert Hoover is always attached to is up intake increase of food production. And it's going to be one of the things that leads us into a great global depression, because the United States farmers gear up to feed the entire world. And then after World War I is over, they don't reduce. They keep producing enough to feed the entire world. And once Europe gets back on its feet and producing their own food, there's not a need for food from the United States anymore. So that becomes a problem. I'm trying to see where I'm at on time. Oh, I'm doing pretty good today. So one of the things he'll do, ration propaganda, billboards, wheatless Mondays, meatless Tuesdays, victory gardens. I'm hoping you've heard of some of these things. Also in the middle of this, we're going to pass the 18th Amendment, the prohibition. We talked about that in our progressive, which prohibits sale, transportation, manufacturing. And at the bottom of page 10, I will put a box around the results of Herbert Hoover's Food Administration. And again, this is essentially important because when we get to the 1920s and our presidents of the 1920s and all of the 1920s is going to be about business. It's this idea of businessmen. And I'm kind of giving a spoiler alert for our 20s. But in the 1920s, what everyone wants their son to be is a businessman. The idolized person is a businessman. And all of our 1920s presidents are businessmen. Hence, ending with Herbert Hoover and this gigantic collapse of our economy and the global depression. But at the bottom of that page is the beginnings of what will lead us to that great global depression. Farm production increases by 25%, and then it never decreases. It never says to itself, hey, we probably should gear back and stop producing so much food. Food exports are going to triple, and again, that eventually is going to go away when Europe gets back on its feet and producing its own food, and we don't stop producing that triple amount. Heatless Mondays, lightless Tuesdays, gasless, etc. And then the top of page 11, we'll have bond drives, which will be Liberty bonds with the purpose of that money going to, again, to support the war effort. Government's going to take over railroads. And then finally, the one thing that we are really going to pay attention to is in the middle of page 11, mobilizing the Army. So we have to mobilize an Army. As I said, we're 15th. We've got 100,000 men. That's not very much. So April and May, Allies are running out of manpower, and we need to get to that front very quickly. The Western Front, and we determine that Western Front from the position of Germany. So the Western Front is that front that is in France. The Eastern Front is on the side of Russia. So that's what that is determined by. So we're going to enter on the Western Front with helping Great Britain and France, who have been holding off Germany for almost 4 years. So what we have to do now is got to get men in the Army. And so on the middle, at the bottom of page 11, B2, Selective Service Act. And the Selective Service Act is a requirement for all men to register for the draft. We still have it. And any of my gentlemen that are 17, you should have already registered for selective service. And it's important that you do so because it takes you out of contention for a lot of government loans and FAFSA if you're not registered for selective service. And registration for men 18 to 45. You can't do anything like in the Civil War, paying somebody to take your place. There are going to be some exemptions, and most of those are religious exemptions, Quakers, pacifists, those types of things. Our result of that, very effective. Within months, the Army increased to over 200,000 to 4 million men. African Americans will be able to be a part of this draft. However, they will not have the same opportunities in the military. They will be mostly regulated to menial jobs and menial tasks without any African Americans moving up in the chain of command. They will be corpsmen, which are corpsmen work in hospitals. They'll be mess cooks. They'll do latrine duty, but very few actually working in high command. None of them will be working in high command. There'll be a few units of African Americans, but for the most part, again, regulated to lesser duties. Women will also be allowed to participate mostly in the roles of nurses, ambulance drivers, and administration type of issues. And turning the page, on page 12, American doughboys. And we're, in World War One, the Europeans will call them doughboys. And a lot of it has to do with this idea of fresh. These are fresh troops. They're coming in, they're brand new, they have seen no combat, they are not cynical, they are not shell-shocked, they are not encumbered by losses. This is a fresh throw of men into the battlefield. And eventually, again, we'll get there. On page 12, you've got this unknown war against Russia. You can look at that. I'm not going to talk much about it. You can read it yourself. So the Western Front, spring of 1918 is when we really get boots on the ground in France. And again, that's almost a whole year from when we declared war in 1917. Spring, Germany launches an offensive in which the United States are participating. At the top of page 13, AEF, that's what our troops are called, American Expeditionary Forces. And one of the things that Wilson was really, really emphatic about is that the United States forces are not going to be under anyone else's command. We're not going to be under anyone else's command. We're standing alone by ourselves, soldiers, Marines, under General Pershing. And that is who our troops would answer to, not part of any bigger coalition or any of those other things. And that is, again, important to note. As we move through that, we've got a couple of battles. Again, Jack Pershing is head of a separate army, and Pershing will take army under the Meuse, and largest battle for the United States, 47 days, and 1.2 million soldiers will participate. End of the war. So that, again, is what we're going to look at. We know the College Board doesn't really ask us questions about battle. So how does the war end? And this is really, really important. Germany is at a low point. They have desertions, food shortages, because the Allies have cut them off, and so they have tremendous food shortages. And so Germany surrenders. And please, on page 13, please look at E2 and draw a big, bold attention to that sentence. Germany surrender spurred by Wilson's 14 points, in particular, the idea of peace without victory. So in essence, what Germany was saying is, we just can't fight anymore. We don't think we've lost, but we don't have the manpower, the supplies, the means to continue this. And so we want to surrender and put an end to this battle. So on November 11th, 1918, Germany lays down their arms. So they, again, essentially, and I would even write that somewhere down on your notes, Germany was not defeated. Germany surrendered under the idea of Wilson's 14 points. Turning the page. So I already talked about segregation on page 14, the idea of what African American troops did. And again, F2, most African Americans in the military did labor duty. Casualties, again, we lost almost 113,000 men. 10 million soldiers are going to die. And again, not to minimize the loss of life, but comparatively speaking, the loss of life of the United States was paled in comparison to what European countries lost as a result of World War I. It is and will continue to be the most catastrophic thing, much more than World War II, is World War I for loss of life. Wilson loses Congress at home. So what that means now is Congress is now controlled by Republicans, and this is going to be difficult for Wilson as he works to create a peace treaty called the Treaty of Versailles. So in order to get to the Treaty of Versailles, we've got to have a peace conference. Please, on page 14, note under Wilson loses Congress at home, C2, Republican senators excluded from the peace delegation. That is a crucial political mistake. that he and our country is going to live with for the next 30 years. It is a crucial mistake politically that Wilson makes. Now, we also have to say that in the middle of all this, Wilson's going to suffer a debilitating stroke. It's going to be seen, I don't know what just happened there. It's going to be seen as to the rest of the people as that he's got pneumonia. But he has a stroke, a full-blown stroke. He is out in the middle of this peace conference. And it will be continued by members of the delegation of the United States, of which, again, Republicans are not part of. So that's going to be really important. So we have the Versailles Peace Conference. Again, it's in Paris, in Versailles, and it will take place in the building and the Palace of Versailles. And we've got four people, big four: the United States represented by Wilson, the UK represented by David Lloyd George, Georges Clemenceau is France, and Orlando by Italy. Now, we call it the Big Four, but really it's the Big Three. Italy kind of gets kicked to the curb very quickly and does not get to participate. Each has their own agenda. Please, on your notes, you need to write out what these three agendas were. For Wilson, it was collective security. It was getting some kind of League of Nations. That's the goal of the United States, so this never happens again. For the UK, it was about getting back to normal. Like, we just need to end this and get our countries back to order. For France, it was revenge. Clear and simple revenge. We don't have this because it's U.S. history, but my AP Euro people should remember this is after the Franco-Prussian War, in which the Prussians will defeat France. And so France says, you guys invaded us twice, not happen again. Spoiler alert, it does, for those of you that don't know that. So that's the goals of these three countries. United States, collective security, League of Nations. UK, England, we got to get back. Our countries are dissolving into anarchy and we need to get back. And France is revenge. We want revenge in any way possible. Money, humiliation, anything possible. So on page 15, goal, League of Nations. And again, you can read through that to make sure that you see what's happening. And so eventually we get this thing known as the Treaty of Versailles. It takes forever to get to the Treaty of Versailles. It is complicated, crazy. Again, part of it is because Wilson has a massive stroke in the middle of it and can't tell anybody. But important, on page 13 is Article 231. And Article 231 is known as the Guilt Clause. And what Article 231, and this is part of France's revenge, is the whole war was caused by Germany, which we know is not true because Austria fired the first shots. But that is what we're looking at. And then B, Germany obligated to pay reparations to the Allies, $31 billion over 30 years. And that's going to be impossible to do. Self-determination, again, we're looking at countries being able to govern themselves, and that will be Yugoslavia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. They all become countries as a result of this. Now, in the middle of that page 15, please underline the name Henry Cabot Lodge. Staunch Republican, leading Republican, and he says no to collective security. We are not doing that. We're not doing it. You got us into a war that had nothing to do with us. You lost American lives that had nothing to do with us. We're never doing that again. And then the United States, after World War I, goes into a period called isolationism. We isolate ourselves. And Henry Cabot Lodge says, we're not doing it. And as a result, the Peace Treaty of Versailles is not and does not become, doesn't pass in the Senate. On page 16, American reaction. Isolationists impose entanglement in the League of Nations. Nope, not going to do it. We don't want to be part of it. On page 16, I will put a big box around defeat of the Versailles Treaty. We don't pass it. We don't pass the Treaty of Versailles. Republicans oppose the treaty. Senator Lodge says if we can amend it, we will pass it. But there's no at all hope of doing that. Wilson is going to have a speaking tour, and he goes around the United States speaking and hoping to persuade the American population to put pressure on their senators to pass the Treaty of Versailles, but it doesn't go well. And he, again, is in very poor health and will collapse on page 17 in Colorado. And again, this says has a stroke, but really it's his second stroke. And he doesn't meet in his cabinet for almost 8 months. On page 17, lodges reservations. You need to put a big box around this because this is really important. This is what leads us into the 1920s. And it's also, again, what's going to lead us into our next catastrophic war, World War II. So Lodge writes 14 reservations. He's got 14 reasons why we should not be part of that. And Wilson says, nope, don't want it. And again, will not, the Treaty of Versailles will not pass. We write a separate peace treaty with Germany, and we don't ratify that until July 25th, 1921, which the war is over in 1919. And that's not until 1921 that we actually ratify. The biggest issue, again, is the League of Nations. And what our Republican senator says to Wilson is, you are tying us up in European events again, and we aren't going to do that. That's not going to be a part of anything that we're going to do. Finishing this up on 18, World War I political results. Again, a big box around this because this is really important. U.S. becomes a world economic and political leader. That is one of the most important outcomes of World War I. We had already been the economic leader going into it, so that's kind of a given, but political leader, yes. And it's the only reason that Wilson is higher up than I think he should be on presidential list because of his ability to lead at that Treaty of Versailles. He really was in control of that. And for the United States, that was a huge step forward in the political leader scene. And after World War I, we are on pace of being the political leader of the world, and that's crucial. The other part that we didn't mention, just because we don't need to know it, we just need to know that it happened, is the Russian Revolution. And that Russian Revolution about communism is going to send the 1920s also in a reason to isolate, because we do not want any of those commies coming into our country. And we're going to do a whole lot of stuff in efforts to keep them out. So that will be important. Britain, France, Austria, Turkey went into various states of decline fast, great decline. And Germany will be devastated by the Treaty of Versailles. And again, eventually is going to lead to World War II. We have an election in 1920, and it will be the first of our Republican presidents for the 1920. And again, those Republican presidents are, the 1920 presidents are defined by Republican businessmen. And our first one will be Warren Harding. And his idea is returning to normalcy. This Democratic president took us into this war that we should never have been a part of. And now we're going to return to normalcy. And we're going to make sure that that is normal. Result, Harding defeats Cox. It is 1920 is the first election that women are allowed to participate. And then please, on that last page, C4, isolationist. I forgot end of progressivism. Progressivism ends with our Republican presidents. It's done. It's over. And we won't see any of those things that progressives were fighting for again until we get to the 1930s and FDR. And we get isolationist. Isolationist turns into a death sentence for the League of Nations. And later the United States will bear part of the blame for World War II as it undercut the League of Nations by refusing to join it. The League of Nations exists. The United States just does not become a part of it. And without the United States, it really doesn't have any kind of strength behind it to implement any of the reparations or the reprimands or the sanctions that it could with the United States. And again, two main causes for the failure of peace after World War I is the Great Depression, etc. Impact of World War I on society, women, again, increased role, suffrage, prohibition, massive African-American migration to the north, increased nativism. Please, D, that's really important for the 1920s. Red Scare is going to begin, and that Red Scare is about communism. Millions of men left home to fight in Europe, and we're going to return to isolationism. So that finishes that up for that chapter. And on Monday, we'll start with the 20s and move quickly through that week. So I hope you have a good weekend. If you're like me, it's kind of like no different between the regular weeks. Again, make sure you look at the instructions on how to send me a video back. I would love to hear from you. I know some of you probably don't really want to do it, and it's okay if you don't want to, but I would love to hear from you, even if it's just 2 seconds of you saying hi to me, because I miss seeing your faces. I really, really miss you guys a lot. And I miss seeing you every morning. So anyway, let me know if you have any questions about the lecture. I know I went through that pretty quickly, but really the important part is what happens after World War I. So I will talk to you on Monday. Please let me know if you have any questions, issues, and have a great weekend. Bye.